Hi, all. Welcome to another episode of Saturday Architecture. A tricky challenge that we faced this week was a scenario in which we have developed a mobile app and it has a notification feature. So when the application starts, it kind of registers itself with the service, and then the Apple service triggers something in the phone, and that sets off a trigger of events, and it crashes the app. Now, the classical approach that we take is kind of put it in a debug mode in a staging environment to check what is happening. Now, here, unlike your conventional thing where everything in the ecosystem is in your control, in this case, we have no control over what the Apple framework infrastructure does. It does what it does. I don't know what it is doing, how it is doing. Now, when we put it into a debug build, it works perfectly fine. This is one of the biggest nightmares of real-time developers or firmware and system developers, right? Things will work very well in debug mode. The moment you switch to device drivers, it will crash. Like, I remember my days of device drivers and firmware development where debug will work perfectly fine and release mode will go. And that usually used to happen because there is an overrun of memory. When you're in debug mode, there is an extra buffer allocated for debugging, and the system is generally little lenient with in a debug mode. So I kind of hit that thing in a normal application scenario. Anyway, the good news is that problem is not there anymore. We kind of in risk we say, avoid, mitigate, or let it go. So here we did avoidance. Okay, so we kind of removed the scenario in which it had to run and kind of moved it to another logical place where that same thing could work. But that actually triggered this thought process, like these are situations which we will run into where in production specific issues are happening, and it makes us clueless, and it doesn't work in the staging environment or in the dev environment. How do we go about handling this? The joke which I get reminded of is there's a heart surgeon who takes his Ferrari for servicing, and then the mechanic, as he's working on the car, he asks him, "What do you do?" He says, "Heart surgeon, I work on it." Then he says, "Oh, okay, looks like you do what I do. I do something to the heart of the car, which is the engine. You do the heart of the human body. So looks like we are in the same profession." Then the doctor smiles and says, "Pretty much the same. There's just one difference. You just have to fix the car when it is running. If you can do that without switching off the car, then yeah, both of us are the same." So it's like this is that kind of a thing, right? You have to do an operation in production. You cannot bring offline systems. So Deepak, have you had experiences like this?
So, there are. Means if you run any application in production, these kinds of issues you will find quite a bit. I mean, it's not uncommon to see such things where things work perfectly fine in the laptop of the developer or the test environment, and finally when it goes to production, things don't exactly behave the same way. So I have lots of examples where the application or the core system itself wasn't at fault. It is the external systems where you have no control over. Example which you just said, right? So I'll give you one example of where solution to one problem became problem for the other system. So there was one service which was being tested, and it was deployed, but and after some troubleshooting, they decided that this has to be shut down, and this should no longer be running. This service should no longer be running. But what they figured out is there was no way to shut down the service. Every time they shut it down, it came back up. Every time they shut down, it came back up. And the no amount of troubleshooting within the service could figure out why this service keeps starting by itself. There is no reason for it to start.
It was on a
What finally?
server, is it?
No.
Windows.
It's so apparently the service used to crash earlier, right?
Okay.
So somebody actually wrote an automation that whenever it crashes, you bring it up.
Okay.
So, so this is like one piece of automation interfering with the intended behavior, right? So that's why whenever we talk about automation and fixing things, I tend to say that you don't treat automation like a retrofit thing. You have to treat automation at the same level as you treat your application code, because now this is part of your how your application behaves. So this is one example. There is another similar example of so this is from the networking and infrastructure kind of a field, where we had this internet connectivity of using a VPN, right? So this VPN was as part of the front end to the coming in and out of the enterprise network, right? And so we had a VPN device at the other end, and people used to be able to connect to that VPN, but after every some duration, it used to just disconnect, and you have to reconnect, right? And if somebody is doing something important, they will just lose connectivity, and general cause of nuisance, right? And we troubleshooted like endlessly, and it did not figure out. This is then when we started looking at it, says let us look at the time when it exactly happens, right? So we started logging exactly when this connection actually fails. So what we figured out was there is an exact, so it was like to the microsecond it was happening. This cannot be a fault. This is some sort of intended behavior which this application, this router seems to behave this way, right?
Okay.
And then what we figured out was, so the reason was because the Cisco device which was there, there is a default behavior of the device that after that X amount of time, the ARP, the address resolution protocol for the IP address, it has to reset it.
Oh, okay.
Right. So exactly at that time, because there is a timer inside the router which it will look at that, and once it's there, it just wipe out all the ARP of the IP address, and so it will no longer allow you to connect, because now you have to re-register the ARP. So if you restart everything, then it starts again, because now the ARP will register again. So that's when we figured out, okay, so there is a override of that behavior which says, okay, do not forget this ARP address, because this is a fixed thing. Please let it run. Don't reassign this piece of memory so that you have access to it. So this is where unintended external things can cause your application, your system to behave differently. So there is no actually magic formula which can avoid doing it. Some of the things which actually I have seen a lot of product teams look at. See, when you have a product in live in production, what they look at is how can they have real-time telemetry available, right? So where the critical functions of the application, for example, the startup of the application, the initialization of the application, where you know things can go wrong, they produce more telemetry than the rest of the application, right? So they are logging it continuously. So if something like that happens, they are able to at least figure out that this is the step where it is going, and that is actually increasingly becoming the standard across all critical applications, where although it entails collecting a lot of data, and you need to have some automated systems where you can actually run queries on data and report when anything abnormal happens. So that is some of the ways where I have seen product teams try to solve such problems where unknown behavior happens. So it's basically is in collecting a lot of data, and similar things happen when you do stuff around security, right? Because security, you don't know how the hacker is going to behave and then what they're going to do to your application or to your system, right? So what you're looking for is abnormalities, right? How do you look at things which are not expected behaviors, right? And some of this is also places where things like machine learning and because it's very difficult to collect so much data, manually analyze it, and then understand what is abnormal behavior. You have to use some sort of machine way to find out what is normal and what is abnormal.
Mm.
With this huge amount of data, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to
I
guess what is
remember during my real-time automation days, I had a very interesting case. I think it's probably 3-4 months into my first working career. We had developed a industrial automation system, which will basically do a test. Okay, so the test will go something like it will. They put the sample into the device and then they increase the pressure. At some point in time, the sample will burst. Okay, so how it works is, and there's a sensor which senses the pressure. So there'll be an increase in pressure, and suddenly the pressure will drop. Okay, when the pressure drops suddenly, that means that the system has burst. Okay, and how do you even start that something has started happening? Is again there is a small spike. So initially there's a small spike, and then it will go all the way up, and then it will burst, and then it will come down. Now, when we develop this application in the lab and in our office, it will work pretty well. Now we take this device and go put it in the factory full. This was in a proper factory, manufacturing facility. So, but then this equipment was in the R&D lab, and we'll go install it. They'll start testing. We'll sit with them. We'll say everything is going good. We'll come back to our office. It takes around 1 hour to come by bike. We'll come back to the office. Then they'll say we got 3 bad samples. It says, damn, we don't know what to do. Okay. So then we'll say, oh, okay, there might be something wrong with the algorithm. We start handling error condition in software such that we adjust that cutoff levels, right? So where it will trigger. Readjust that and says,
Calibration.
Okay, now the calibration is good. Yeah, correct. Calibration. It says, yeah, we have calibrated it well. Okay, seems good. Okay. So let's go back. So look at the data, samples, and then calibrate it, put it, sit there. Working. Oh, okay, very good. Come back to office. Sir, not working. This went on for close to 2 weeks. Okay. Then the hardware team said, looks like some noise data is coming in. Okay. So then we started doing noise removal. Okay. Luckily, it helped me learn Fourier transforms. And what is the use of that? So interestingly, Fourier transforms is the way in which you can convert something which is happening in a time domain into a frequency domain. So what happens is, like, let's say, to explain this easily, right? Fourier transform, one of my friends explained.
So basically, you're converting x-axis to y-axis in a very crude way.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. So it's something like, for example, let's say there is a bus which leaves at 5:05, 5:10, 5:15, like that. So if I kind of plot what all times it left, you will actually mark it as 5:55, like that. Now, when you convert it using a Fourier transform, it will say every 5 minutes. So it becomes one data point. Right? You just have frequency. It will just say one data point every 5 minutes. Beginning at 5, at every 5 minutes, this will happen. So there's another event that happens at every 10 minutes that will come there. So what were like huge amount of data now just gets transformed to just 2. Okay. So So that's way in which, so then what happens is these additional stuff will come out as additional dots, and you can kind of remove the dots. So in real time, we have to do a Fourier transforms and did that. Then we go ahead and put it. 1 week it seems to be fine. After a week, again problem. Then we did a hard. Then they said, we have to do noise filtration at a hardware. So the hardware team worked hard, added filters and all. 2 months later, we're still in the same problem. Okay. Now the problem with this is this. Practical problem is it happens once in a while. Okay. But this is a quality test the manufacturing facility uses.
Yeah, you cannot have unreliable.
So it cannot be. So what they do is a sampling test only. Now, if the sampling test itself is, so out of a batch of 100, you pick 10. And in the 10, 2 is an error, then there's a multiplication factor of that sample. So out of 1,000 samples, I'm taking 10, which means if I have one error, it will get multiplied by 100 again.
Yes.
So it's really absolutely unacceptable to have even a error condition.
As a mechanical engineer, I can appreciate that.
Okay, so it's not like, chalo 10% of the errors ko ignore kar dete hain. No, you cannot do that.
You cannot.
So then eventually I was sitting one day really frustrated, and then I was sitting in the lab, and then we were trying to do this. And then I'm just looking at it, and then there's our device here. There is a small cable which is running from there to our computer, which is like probably some 2 feet away. And it's that device is all run in 5 volts, plus or minus 5. That's how it works. So it's very
the signal voltage.
Yeah. That's all you need to detect IoT kind of things, right? So today's IoT, there it was simple sensors. Okay. Usiko, we call it with a new name now.
Now everything is a sensor.
So there was one big black pipe there. So I asked him, what is this pipe doing? It sounds very odd. Okay. So I said, what is this pipe doing in this lab? He said, no, that is a pipe which is going to the factory. Oh, okay. What is there in the pipe? He says, no, those are power lines. Okay. Power lines for what? So those power lines were going to some huge motors. When I say huge, they are really huge. Imagine a motor which turns a bucket the size of, the diameter will be like 10 meters. Okay, so it's something which rotates, that turbine kind of a thing. Big, huge it is. Okay. Then it struck me, the problem was when they started those, so those
huge spike.
Things, yeah, it'll stop and stop, right? So when it starts, there'll be a spike. Now that thing is carrying 500 volts, that a spike there induces a spike in this. So the debugging was this. Took that wire, lifted it 6 feet up and sellotaped it. Problem solved.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so that's all. Problem solved after that. Nothing happened after that. Okay. Now, this was fluke. I say it's a mixture of common sense, fluke, all things get together.
I wouldn't say this is fluke, because this is what problem solving is all about. I don't consider such things as fluke, because you are intentionally trying to solve the problem. It's not like you went there and randomly you figured out that there's a power line which runs through it, right? You are looking for that problem. It is not. So I wouldn't classify this as a fluke, because there's an intention behind solving the problem, and you are looking for the clues. You are looking for the environment where errors could come from. So I won't say this is a fluke, because I think you won't find it unless you look for it.
Actually, you probably gave a clue to solving this issue, and I think it kind of leads back to one of the core tenets of the HypoHa framework, which is intention orientation. Right, so we keep harping on that, right? I think that's one of the key tenets of the HypoHa framework. If you look at classical frameworks which exist, like let's say it's Six Sigma or ITIL or ISO, they all talk about how to increase the quality of a product or a service that is being done. Okay. So they say this is a service, define it, make sure it has got good quality. The moment you define a service, you're also defining the output of that, which means
Right.
you're straitjacketed the solution already. You can't go beyond what is expected there out of that service. Okay. And the output is a clearly mentioned deliverable and an action and a result very well defined. Now, the moment you switch to an intention oriented world, then the intention of the service makes all the difference. So, actually, I take back, yeah, it's not luck, it's actually the intention orientation. So, what is the intention of the service, right? Or what is the intention of the product? That is, I would go ahead and make that. I don't see any other thing which captures that intention.
Yeah, yeah. You see, different frameworks try to mention this intention in different ways,
Okay.
right? So some of them measure intention by customer satisfaction. What does the customer actually want from this service? How is the customer going to be satisfied if you do something, right? So if you start looking at the service from the customer's point of view, in a different way the intention comes in, although your service may not be intended to satisfy that specific requirement. But when you start looking at it from the customer's perspective, you start looking at, why does this service exist, right? What are the people trying to do with this service? Why do they come back to this, or why do they don't come back to this?
I'm actually curious. Have you really seen that happening? Because, like, why I'm asking that question is, like, let's say it's about maintaining data quality, right? Now, in that case, we are only maintaining the customer, or the customer in this case happens to be the IT guys and not the actual end users. So the customer definition itself in that case is like, this is going to be the people who are in the customers or the app owners.
Yes.
They become the customer, right? But for them, as long as the application is up and running, it's okay.
No, that's what the application up and running may not be the only thing, right? Because if the application is running and it is not doing what it was intended to do, right? if the purpose of the application is to produce a result, right, it may be up, but if it is giving erroneous result, or it is giving some random things, application is running, but the intention of the application to produce that result is not satisfied. How do you, if you're building that application, it is your job as an architect, as a developer, to make sure that whatever that the deliverable of that application is being actually delivered, and you monitor that instead of seeing that whether the application is running or not.
I completely agree with you, Deepak, but the thing which I have seen is, right, or the bias that sets in is, somebody is providing a network service or a file service, right? They are just telling, to the app owner, I am giving you 9.9 availability of this. My if it's, let's say, a NAS service is there, my IOPS is this is what I'm signing up for. That data is making an unhappy customer is not my problem.
Actually, if you look at it purely from the component service perspective, right, that is a reasonable thing for that component provider to do. See, if I'm a component of the entire chain, network is just one component, right? I just own one part of it. I have no control over what everybody else does with their stuff, but I can control that the network is stable. I have dual homing. I have all these backup features available, so I can guarantee that if a packet comes into my component, it will leave with 99.99% availability. Right? It will not get lost. Right?
Yeah.
That is the component level stuff I can guarantee. Right? I can say, okay, I've built my system, it will deliver this. But the application owner what that application owner, the person who is using that component in their system, they have to think about whether this is acceptable to them or not, whether this is helping their outcome or not, right? Maybe they need another 9, right? Say, okay, I cannot do with the 3 9s, I need 4 9s, right? Whatever that may be their or they can go back and say, okay, I know this component has these limitations. They cannot give me 4 9s. They can give me only 3 9s. How can I handle this in my application? Right. This is actually a very common scenario which I've seen with when applications move from their on-prem environment to the cloud. Right. Okay. Very common scenario. It suddenly says, oh, when this thing was running in my own data center, I had full control. I could monitor this. I could monitor that. I could tell you what exactly is wrong. Now in the cloud, I don't know what is happening. SQL server is somewhere in this server, this location. My web server is some other location. I cannot guarantee what is happening, right? Neither AWS nor Azure is confirming where the packet is getting lost, right? So that is where you have to, from the architecture perspective, they have to understand that how the things have changed. The components in the clouds do not behave the same way as they used to do in your on-prem network, right? Where you could guarantee 4 9s, 5 9s availability. In the cloud, when systems, because what they are doing is they are scaling the system out and they are sharing that whole infrastructure with multiple customers, right? So, and it is very likely that some of those things will cause delays. They may not behave the same way as your own on-premises dedicated network will work for you, right? And then that is where when you start building these retries and other things into your application, so that you understand that underlying infrastructure behaves differently. You need to be able to see that and don't assume that the way it used to work in the so these are all external factors in your application. So your application has not changed, but the underlying infrastructure has changed. The way it behaves is changed. So you have to modify your application to work with those limitations.
I agree, but what I see is when people work at that level, like let's say there is an infrastructure guy providing it, okay? So he is stuck into that I have to give 0.99 more, okay? For that, I have to upgrade my hardware, and that's going to take so much of time and money, and I'm working on that. Right. And then that drags on for years together, and the application person will say, we are waiting for the infrastructure to come up, because the infrastructure is there, this is the best that we can do, okay? And they kind of get stuck in that place because they've got fixated on 0.99 I have to make it 0.999, okay? Both of them are stuck there. This person is stuck waiting for the infrastructure to go. But if they switch to intention orientation, then the conversation between both of them changes. So the network person kind of steps beyond his boundary, that my job is to give 0.99 to 999. So in his mind, it's a mindset thing. The infra guy is thinking, what the app guy says, I have to give it to him. If he says, give me 0.999, my job is to give 0.99 only. Yeah. Okay. But he doesn't say, what is the intention? He doesn't ask the question, why do you want 0.999? What are you trying to solve with that? That's very rarely happens, is what I have seen.
And that is probably true. That is probably true. Because stepping outside your boundary to understand some other domain's problem, it requires the expansion of the mind, which is not available all the time.
Very easy, yeah.
It requires knowledge, which requires some space in your brain, which may be occupied with what you need to deliver, right? So that's why I believe it's difficult to achieve. It is desirable. I would say it is desirable.
Actually, it's kind of interesting when you just said that, right? There's no bandwidth. It actually leads to another fractal in Hypoha, which is curiosity. Right? Become curious of why is that person even asking for 999. Now, if you look at it, right? Now, let's say they go into the app, okay? The irony is even the app developer is not really thinking like that. The app developer is telling that, I need to service 50 requests per second because the business asked me.
But they don't go back and ask, why do you need 50?
Yeah, what is the purpose of why do you need to handle 50 requests? Now the business will say, we are doing holiday shipping, 100 people will come, we have to meet them. That's it. Okay, so they are like, I have seen that there are 100 customers walking in, all of them will give a submit button, and all of them have to be serviced. I cannot turn away customers. Okay.
Right.
So each of them gets stuck in that action oriented thing. It's kind of interesting to me that I didn't realize that production issue actually translates to kind of intention orientation and curiosity at the end of the day. So probably in this case, if I had got stuck that I have to fix it through electronics or hardware, and I'm just thinking, how can I make it better? How can I make it better? Something beyond this, right? Like moving that cable would have never occurred to me.
You'll be surprised actually how many times that happens, right? So I'm sure this has happened to you n number of times during your entire career. You have managed so many applications, deployed, developed so many things, right? I'm sure this has happened more than once.
Yeah.
Right. So I believe this comes back to your intention orientation. So if your intention is to solve the problem, some of these things happen. You don't have to force it also. Means I don't think you intended to force yourself to think that way.
No, I did not.
Right?
Correct. Yeah. You can't. Actually, you can't, because you don't know how to
force yourself to do something. Yeah. It's just that your intention was to let me find out everything possible. Right. So when you go into that everything possible mode, then you start looking outside your domain. You start looking at outside the box thinking, right? So, and this is what I've seen happen with all troubleshooting jobs. This
Good
is not,
troubleshooters.
Yeah.
I think the majority of the population gets stuck within the box.
Yes, that's why the expertise in troubleshooting is a rare expertise. Right?
I think probably that's where when we started, you were telling it's more a problem-solving thing than actually a production issue or a asynchronous issue.
Exactly. So this troubleshooting ability is rare, and it is highly valued. Right? You must have heard this joke, right? So some guy had a problem with his big ship, with his engine, and then they called him and says he put one hammer and it struck one place and the whole thing started working. And he said he gave him a $1 million bill. He says, you just came and struck one hammer. He says, that was $1 for that, but what are 999,000 is all because of knowing where to hit the hammer. Right. So that is where the troubleshooting skill, I would say, that requires. And what we're trying to deconstruct here is, how does that happen, right? And the people who are trying to, it's not like any, with what you also preach as part of your framework is, it is possible to develop any skill, right? And developing troubleshooting skill requires such opening up of your mind and making sure that you think about all the possible things, and you start looking at it as an intention rather than focusing on that small piece of information which you don't have or have.
I think it's actually I was not that clear, but this conversation has made it like when I was looking at it, how do we handle it from a technical perspective, right? But then that is just one. I would actually say it's a lesser weightage factor. I think the bigger factors are, one is around the intention by which that scenario, why it exists, right? And what is the service that we are trying to provide. And getting that intention very clear. When you hit a scenario like this and you're clueless, first take a step back and probably define, this is the intention of me wanting to do it. And then become curious about what is stopping me from meeting the intention.
Yep.
And probably I think that's how we actually handled this issue also, that you said, you know what, I need to kind of notify my customers. Okay, so why not, if I don't have to do it in the first 30 seconds, I can do it after 1 minute also, because the end user does a login, the home page loads. Till then, they don't need notification. They can get notification even after a minute. It's all right. Nothing really comes crashing down.
If it is not time sensitive in that sense, means
So it is
urgent.
not. It's not that within 1 minute he has to be notified, otherwise hell will come crashing loose. No, it's okay. So after 2 minutes also, they could do that. Now, maybe it's not a perfect technical solution to why it's happening, but it achieves the intention, or the intention for the customer. So I think that's a good point to kind of summarize, two things came out. One is, of course, add more telemetry, so that anything coming into your application, we have data for it. So it kind of gives us some clues, right? So all input and output points, we have some. So I'm building my application, so I know how external control enters into it and what goes out. So if I can have telemetry at those points, then I know what's coming in and going out. Okay, so probably that needs to be kind of built in from an architecture perspective. And I guess when you do that, you have no clue why you are doing it, but it's just that you need that. Probably it's probably a technical representation of curiosity, right? I'm curious about what is coming into my application, and I'm curious about what's going in. You're converting that curiosity into a code. Call it telemetry.
Yes.
And then you have an intention orientation, which says what's the overall thing, why this service is there for the end customer. And then when you hit an issue, you take that, you apply your curiosity to all the data that is by looking at the data, and keep the intention in mind, and probably that will help you figure out some ways out of this deadlock situation that you run into. I think it's a tough problem.
In some ways, actually, all programmers do this in their code, right? So when they're debugging something, right? But the thing is that they don't take it outside their domain. That is what.
I think you're being very liberal and generous. I mean, like when a thing doesn't work right, I have found that majority of the programmers just do brute force, debug. It's only people who have done hardcore system programming or firmware even have a habit of logging and looking at logs. I think that thing of, let me log and check, right? Let me go to the logs and verify. That culture is actually kind of dropped down, because the kind of programming that we are doing nowadays is pretty low. I think but I think that leads to curiosity. Let me be curious about what's happening before I jump in. And otherwise, what happens is, one random solution, go implement, check what happens, then another solution, then tweak that, keep on changing the code to see if it works.
Hit and trial.
Hit and try kind of a thing that they get into. But I think it's a good discussion. I think it boils down to two things, right? Curiosity and intention, and then have a technical implementation of these concepts. I don't know how you cannot implement an intention, but you can define it, because by nature, if you can define an intention in black and white, then it becomes an action and the result. So an intention will be at that vague level. And probably for the curiosity part, of course, that you can kind of do it into logs or telemetry. And the challenge, of course, is the moment you say telemetry, you have to do it such that it doesn't interfere with your performance. And actually, I'm just seeing something. Interestingly, telemetry has multiple layers of types. One is telemetry at a business layer, which says profits, revenue, new users, average session. And then there is telemetrics at application layer, which is about response times, transactions, and then telemetrics at the infrastructure layer, IO, RAM usage, and then there is telemetrics at the client layer, errors on the web, network pipeline kind of a thing. And then
There's a new
telemetrics.
term for it. Now there's a new term for it. They call it observability.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yes, they call it observability. So how do you observe something? Is you get data about it. So if you want to build, so the intention of telemetry is now called as do you have observability in your system, right? So can we observe everything possible what is happening inside the application? So that's a new sort of from the DevOps world. This has come. It's called observability.
So okay. And then there is supposed to be a deployment telemetry.
You know where the word telemetry comes from, right?
No.
So telemetry comes from this whole rocket science.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because most of the time is when the whole development starts, all they're interested in to find out why something failed. And they want to collect data. And remotely collect data. That is why it's called telemetry. So you remotely collect data about what is happening inside the rocket. So that's the history behind telemetry.
Oh, okay, got it. I think that Mars Finder story is the best story as far as this whatever scenario that we are talking about, right? It keep resetting sometime, long time back, and they had to fix that. Great. I think that was a good discussion, and I think it's like one of our usual calls, right? You stand up with somewhere and then you end up with something else.
This is interesting, actually, coding error which resulted in a huge failure kind of a thing, which probably you might have. The Hubble telescope, which is orbiting outside. I think it probably, I don't know whether it is decommissioned or not. But so when they launched it, so the curvature of that telescope that was done using a computer program, and there was an error in that. So the curvature was off by few millimeters, and so once they opened that whole telescope to start measurement, everything was out of focus.
Okay.
So they had to send an astronaut to go and fix the Hubble telescope through the International Space Station. I think the shuttle, there was one of the shuttle missions actually was to, you can search this one. The one of the shuttle missions was to go and fix that error.
Okay.
So the fixing of the error was very simple. It says you move the because the focus changed, so you have to move physically. You have to move something to fix the focus.
Okay.
Right. So
this is another.
So this is a coding error.
Coding error, and it's a real-time production issue kind of a thing, right?
Yeah,
it's
absolutely
hard to fix it. Interesting.
And coding errors have resulted in so many. Means people say program cannot cause life and death issues. These are all huge billions of dollars of expense issues.
Super. Okay, great. Thanks, Deepak. That was a great discussion, and hope to catch all of you again in the weeks to come. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.